Daughter of Alfred the Great, sister of Edward the Elder, aunt of Athelstan, Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, was associated by blood with the three greatest kings in all English history. However, Aethelflaed was not defined by the men she happened to be related to. Her contributions to the uniting of England as a country were truly immense. Today, in search of female trailblazers, most historians are drawn towards the brilliant Tudor Queen Elizabeth I. However, without Athelflaed's tireless efforts 700 years earlier, the magnificence of Elizabeth's reign and of other English monarchs may have taken on an altogether different nature. Here we take a closer look at the life of Athelflaed. There is uncertainty over the date of Athelflaed's birth, but it is most likely to have been in 870, shortly before her father Alfred became King of Wessex, and her birthplace is equally mysterious, with one historian suggesting Chippenham, although that is purely speculation. Athelflaed's mother was Ealhswith, who was married to Alfred for over 30 years, from 868 until Alfred died in 899. Ealhswith's own father was Athelred Mucel, a Mercian nobleman, and Athelflaed's ties with Mercia grew even stronger when she married the Lord of the Mercians, another Athelred. Athelflaed's childhood came as her father fought valiantly against the Vikings, although he did not forget the importance of the education of his children. It has been suggested that for her education, the young Athelflaed was sent to the court of her aunt, Athelswith, who was the wife of King Burgred of Mercia, although the evidence for this is somewhat flimsy. The precise date of Athelflaed's marriage to Athelred again is unknown. She was recorded as being the wife of the Mercian ruler in a charter of 887, so it seems likely that she was married to Athelred no earlier than 885. With him, Athelflaed would remain married for around a quarter of a century, until Athelred's death in 911, producing one child with him, a daughter. Asa, the contemporary biographer of Alfred the Great, makes reference to two Welsh princes submitting to Alfred in order to escape, in the words of Asa, the tyranny of Athelred. But during her marriage to Athelred, Athelflaed must have grown in stature. If she hadn't, then that would make her accomplishments as sole ruler, as Lady of the Mercians, even more remarkable. Whilst there is not exactly an abundance of evidence for Athelred and Athelflaed's relationship, the latter's name did appear frequently in charters, and the royal couple strengthened the defences of Worcester somewhere towards the end of the 800s. Whilst Athelred has had his fair share of criticism over the centuries, it is clear that he and Athelflaed provided Mercia with a degree of stability, certainly when stood in contrast to other regions, not just in England, but across the Channel also. However, when Athelred died, Athelflaed became far more ambitious. Simply repelling the Vikings was no longer good enough. Areas that had been conquered by the invaders must be retaken. Athelflaed's father died in 899. For more than 2 decades, Alfred the Great had been plagued by the debilitating Crohn's disease, but still, that didn't stop him from pressing on with his duties as king. Asa praises him as such. And what of the cities and towns to be rebuilt, and of others to be constructed when there were previously none? And what of the royal halls and chambers, marvellously constructed of stone and wood at his command? And what of the royal residences of masonry, moved from their old position and splendidly reconstructed at more appropriate places by his royal command? Alfred's brilliant work went beyond construction as well. Militarily, he had learned lessons from the reign of his brother, yet another, Athelred, and proved to be a magnificent commander in battle, defeating the Vikings at Edington in 878 and even enjoying naval success over them as well. He also retook London, which he granted to Athelred and Aethelflaed. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the way he had prepared his children for life in the Viking Age. Aethelflaed, as Athelred's consort, was already proving herself to be worthy of ruling, and her brother, Edward the Elder, would also prove to be a magnificent successor to Alfred the Great. In 909, a combined force of men from Wessex and Aethelflaed's and Aethelred's Mercians defeated the Vikings at Tettenhall. But in 910, the year before Aethelred died, a Viking army swept into Mercia and raided in a devastating fashion. When Aethelflaed became sole ruler of Mercia, she would have been well aware of the courage that she would need in times as harsh as these. As she would prove, she had that courage in abundance. Shortly after the victory at Tettenhall, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles states that Aethelflaed built the stronghold of Bremsbrig, which appears to have either been in Gloucestershire or Herefordshire. Regardless of its location, it was a clear indication of Aethelflaed's authority, even whilst Aethelred was still alive. In 912, Aethelflaed also built strongholds at a site that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles calls Skurget, a site that remains unidentified, before building another fort at Bridgenorth in Shropshire. She continued with her building work in 913, with fortifications at Tamworth and then Stafford, with Warwick's defences also strengthened in 914. That year, a Mercian army repulsed an invading Viking force that had crossed the Channel from Brittany. In 917, Aethelflaed captured Derby, which one historian describes as being Aethelflaed's greatest triumph. That success came at a personal price for Aethelflaed, however. Four Thanes, who were, in the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, dear to Aethelflaed, were killed in the campaign. But still, like her brother, Edward the Elder, Aethelflaed continued on her relentless mission to not only halt the Viking incursions, but drive them back, and perhaps even expel them from the land. The next year, Aethelflaed showed a different side to her. Previously, she had shown brilliantly that she could organise armies, build defences, and protect her people, but in 918 she demonstrated she could also expand her territories by using all her political guile, as she peaceably got control of Leicester. The brilliance of Aethelflaed's leadership had earned her enough renown that her enemies were now willing to surrender to her and her forces without too much extensive resistance. Not long after, the men of York, in Danish hands, came to swear loyalty to Aethelflaed, but shortly after, Aethelflaed died. At the time of her death, on the 12th of June 918, Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, was still on the warpath. She, along with Edward the Elder, had achieved brilliant successes, and Mercia would come under Edward's control. Edward profited immeasurably from the efforts of his sister, and on hearing of her death, he rode to Tamworth, where he must have been incredibly sorrowful at her passing, and also immensely grateful for what she had accomplished. Even in the age of the Viking Wars, Aethelflaed had shown, especially during her relatively brief time as sole ruler of Mercia, that female rule was not only possible, but it could also be spectacularly successful. The chronicler William of Malmesbury praises Aethelflaed extensively, albeit he gives off the air of someone who finds it hard to believe that a woman like Aethelflaed could rule so successfully. William paints a picture of a strong-willed woman, and he attributes Aethelflaed only having one child with Aethelred as a result of a particularly difficult labour, and says that Aethelflaed refused her husband's sexual advances from that point on. To his credit, Aethelred seems to have respected Aethelflaed's wishes. From there on, Aethelflaed instead dedicated her life to a very different cause, one not expected of a woman. William of Malmesbury says that Aethelflaed had an enlarged soul and was a spirited heroine who aided her brother greatly with her advice and of building cities. Fierce to the end, incredibly courageous and wise, Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, is a woman you cannot help but admire tremendously.